Tiny in All That Air, the Philip Larkin Society podcast.
Hello and welcome to Tiny and All That Air, the Philip Larkin Society podcast. My name is Lynn Lockwood. My guest today is writer David Biespiel, who was born in Texas and who is now poet in residence at Oregon State University. He has written for numerous publications and reviewed poetry for the Washington Post and the New York Times. He's taught creative writing at universities across the United States, has won many awards and published several books of his own poetry. David got in touch with the Society via social media, and I'm so pleased he was able to find some time to come and talk to us about Philip Larkin's poetry, as well as British and American poetry in general.
Well, thank you for having me on the podcast. Long-time listener, first-time caller, and I appreciate the work you're doing. I've learned a ton.
Thank you. It's great.
I'm David Biespiel. I'm an American poet, novelist, critic, memoirist, Sunday painter, and I grew up in Texas, and I live in Oregon. I live in Portland on an acre and a half of forest, about 20 minutes from downtown. My interest in Larkin, I've been thinking about that a lot, where maybe it began. I feel pretty confident that it began with the Paris Review interview. I don't know that I think that was in the mid-'80s. I don't know that I was a subscriber to the Paris Review. I would have been in college or just finishing college when I probably first read the interview. And I was just starting to write poems. And I think I just was attracted to his self-deprecating persona in that interview as well. Then in the interview, the ways in which he alluded to other writers, which Yeats and Hardy and so on, that sent me to those writers more deeply than I had as an undergrad. I was very grateful for. And then that led me to the books. I didn't know the poems. Maybe I knew a poem, maybe church going. I don't know, whatever would have been in an anthology that I had my hands on.
Yeah.
And but it led me to the slender volumes, which I loved. I loved that they were slender. I loved their kind of pocket size, Faber books, the whole kind of texture of it. And it was not easy to find a poet in the United States in my reading. He wrote with the kind of clarity and kind of moral intelligence that Larkin possessed. I don't know that in my early 20s I would have defined it that way. I just found him to be full of surprises in the poems, differently than the poets who were being celebrated then. I'll just name one. Don't mean to pick on him, but someone like John Ashbery, who was a more expansive poet, came out of traditions I recognize as American traditions. Then I remembered in preparing for today, reading I was living in Washington, D.C. by then, reading in the Washington Post in the late 80s, maybe 89, a book review by a guy named Henrik Allen, I think, who I'd never heard of. That began, and I found it, so I thought you would find this unimpressive, as I did. Americans dread poetry, it begins, especially poetry they're told is good. But here's Philip Larkin's collected poems on the Washington syllabus, etc. And then goes about asking why, and spends most of the time criticizing Larkin. But the review was terrible by starting with that no one likes poetry or no one reads poetry or that Americans don't know anything about poetry. I was especially offended. I was very young. And I wrote the book world editor, and I don't have a copy of this, but I wrote my own review. And this, I think, was Slate, the original Slate.
Yeah, the collected poems.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Slate 1. And 1.0. And sent it to the editor and said, I'd like to review for you because I don't think you have a very good poetry. And they hired me to review poems for them based on that. So
Oh,
that
fantastic.
I owe something of my now finished career as a book reviewer to Philip Larkin and trying to defend his work.
So the collected poems have been put onto a syllabus.
Well, the collected poems was being widely reviewed in the States when I first came out
Okay. Yeah.
in the late 80s. That's how I came to, and then I was very interested in that book. Like others, I think I struggled with the arrangement.
Yeah.
I know that's a controversy that doesn't seem that important anymore, but
Yeah, I know what you mean about the ordering. I'm very fond of that volume because it was my first volume of poetry, is Larkin poetry back in the late 80s as well. And then I just dipped into it. So I didn't realise, particularly I hadn't really noticed it was in chronological order.
yeah.
And then, of course, as I got more to teaching Larkin and more interested in Larkin, I was going back to it and I was suddenly thinking, well, this is impossible. I don't know which collection, which poems from, and it's all in the wrong order. But since then, I was very kindly given the concordance to that book, and so the concordance fits obviously to the exact page, and it's come back to life. And I do like now knowing that I can go and see a chronologically ordered collection, and as you say, the body of Larkin's work has been, we've added to it since then. New poems have arrived, etc., that were found from when Anthony first put that collection together. But yeah, I think a lot of people have a lot of affection for that. It's a very iconic cover, and for a lot of people, it's their first Larkin purchase.
Yeah. I don't feel quite as exercised by it as I did at the time, and I, like you, I do now kind of enjoy seeing the kind of true creative development that the book sequences. But I did remember feeling at the time that in the back of the book are the volumes in order.
That's
the
right.
tables of contents, and I remember thinking, well, clearly he knows this is wrong. Otherwise, he wouldn't make this acknowledgement. But it doesn't keep me awake the way.
No, it's interesting. I don't suppose that's been done to many poets. I don't know.
It was very rare, very kind of unique. And you'll see interesting orders conceived of for selected poems, either from the earliest to the latest, or from the most recent sort of backfilling toward the earliest, and so.
Yeah.
I'm putting together. I'm done, but my new and selected's coming out next year, 30 years.
Oh, okay.
And I decided, just in the same vein of kookiness, that I would start with the new and then go to the first. So it has 10 or 12 brand new poems, and then the next chapter is my first book.
Oh, okay.
And partly it was because I thought maybe my most recent poems and my first published poems had something in common, and I wanted to kind of show that cohesion. And other than Larkin's switching back to Larkin, very first book, which had kind of symbolist vibe, even though it's really impossible not to know that it's the same person writing.
Yeah.
Very cohesive writing, but it's not always the case.
So with your collection, you've got 12 new poems, and then you've got your previous collections just reprinted as they are. Then, so you've
it's not a complete. It's a selection.
All right.
There's about 8 or 9. Well, maybe you'll find this interesting. I often think that selected poems typically are bloated, and it's like going to a retrospective at a museum that fills an entire floor, and you can't separate the masterpieces from the journey in the work. That every artist does. Every poet. I mean, that's the thing with the Archie Burnett. It's enormous. There's just so much. There's just so much in there, and as a book of scholarship, it's great. But I think if you wanted to get to know Larkin, you would probably start with one of the slender volumes, probably from one that has a poem you liked, whether it was High Windows or Church Going.
Yeah, and they are so accessible in comparison, aren't they? When you've got one of those, like High Windows, compared to Archie Burnett's. Archie Burnett's is just such an amazing work of scholarship, and you go to it to learn about the poems and to get. He collated all that information about the poems and the editorial and the workbooks, and I am interested when people look at poetry selections. I wouldn't like to have to select 30 Larkin poems or something. It's be impossible.
Oh, that would be fun.
It'd be fun.
You'd leave things out, but that's just, someone else can pick 30 and put those in. I think Larkin's popularity in the States is akin to the popularity of an American poet like Elizabeth Bishop. It's the orderliness, it's the ordered mind. It's the craftsperson. It's someone who's chiseling the poems and not just regurgitating the poems and letting their facility take their verbal facility. It's poets who are in conversation as much with the material as they are with the art. And I think that's why Larkin is more popular here probably than Hughes. Footnote, I think Hughes has trouble being popular in America because of Sylvia Plath. And then Bishop here probably more popular than, say, Lowell, and just that order that stays intact. And it feels like it's part of a conversation with the art. I want to say, too, that I think I remarked in our correspondence that I didn't feel as influenced by Larkin, but I really have been influenced by Larkin. Not the style. I don't think that my style is... I just have never felt that confident. That confidence that he puts across in his writing, enormous confidence of expression. But the arrangement, I remember I was thinking about what it was that I was learning from Larkin. I think it was the learning from him how to arrange poems, how to arrange segments of poems, how to think in a poem, which I think is one of the hardest things to pull off as a writer, is to dramatize thinking. Because by the time you've sort of got through the poem over months or longer, you already know what the outcome is going to be. And so you still have to stage it so that the outcome is a surprise of some kind, or discovery, or inevitability. I also like that the poems had antecedents. I remember as the poems had antecedent. And so it was always, that seemed 100% sense. That you would be writing poems in conversation. Poems were seeping into your imaginary skill set that you either were aware or you were not aware that you would already encounter. And then Larkin seemed a high quality craftsman.
He was so hugely widely read. Like if you've read many of his letters, but particularly his letters to Monica, the literary references are just, they come thick and fast and from all over, from Dick Francis to Shakespeare, all kinds of Augustan poets, romantic poets, contemporary poets, dragoons, whatever it was. He just absorbed so much, and Monica was the same, I think, and they were communicating in kind of quotes and poetry and literature, and and he had that upbringing as well with his parents. He was encouraged to read widely, even from a young age, and so that's his language, isn't it? That it's the language of everything he's ever read is very, very much at his fingertips.
Yeah, and that to me is a job requirement for a puppet, is to be engaged with the poetry that precedes us, because one's role is to care for that in whatever fashion, whether it's privately or in a public way, like those pieces that you read of mine, and certainly on your own desk. Care for it, be in relationship to it in your own work, for good or for ill.
Yeah.
And then, pass it on. It just goes into the future, to the beyond. And I think that poets who work past their second or third decade know this. We just know this, because the contemporary poetry that's happening all the time is exciting, but it's unpredictable. What I love about Larkin's, I remember, is the kind of common Larkin move, which I mentioned to you before, which is noticing something, coming back to it a second time, and then the humor of it. Coming up England by a different line for once, early in the cold New Year. We stopped and, watching men with number plates sprint down the platform to familiar gates. Why, Coventry, I exclaimed. I was born here. I leant far out and squinted for a sign that this was still the town that had been mine so long, but found I wasn't even clear which side was which. From where those cycle crates were standing, had we annually departed for all those family halls? The whistle went. Things moved. I sat back, staring at my boots. Was that when a friend smiled where you have your fruits? No. Only where my childhood was unspent. I wanted to retort. Just where I started. By now, I've got the whole place clearly charted. Our garden first went. I did not invent blinding theologies of flowers and fruits, and wasn't spoken to by an old hat. And here we have that splendid family I never ran to when I got depressed. The boys all biceps and the girls all chest. Their comic form, their farm where I could be really myself. I'll show you come to that. The bracken where I, never trembling, sat determined to go through with it, where she lay back and all became a burning mist. And in those offices, my doggerel was not set up in blunt 10-point, nor read by a distinguished cousin of the mayor, who didn't call and tell my father, there before us, had we yet to see ahead. You look as though you wish the place in hell, my friend said, judging from your face. Oh, well, I suppose it's not the place's fault, I said. Nothing, like something happens anywhere. It's kind of devastating, the end, it really is. I mean, it's that serrated, double-sided knife.
Yeah, the idea that him being born is nothing.
Well, and when you get to know this poem with the other one, with the Thomas Hood poem, and you see how sincere that one was, you recognize centuries have gone by and standing in the world, one starts to get very easily literary critical about it, adjudicating one's personal past, but also just thinking about memory in general, which is so connected to our emotional state when we are in the process of memory. It makes you want to ask the question about the person speaking the poem. You thought to stick to today's speaker, played by Philip Larkin, where they were in their sense of themselves in the orchestration of the poem. Another day, another feeling of lack of or more than confidence might have produced a different effect, different feelings, different criteria, different explanations, examples.
I like the sort of story of the poem and the plot of the poem, that he's taken by surprise. He's in Coventry, because I know in his letters he says this was based on a real train journey. He was on the train up to Liverpool to get the boat back over to Belfast, and he hadn't expected, as it says, we came by a different line, so he hadn't expected to be going through Coventry. And then to suddenly find your birthplace there, the sign, as your train stops at the station, you can imagine that being like, oh, I didn't expect to come through here. And he does have a strong response. There's a lovely sort of spontaneity. And what you were saying before about taking you on a journey, even though it's a poem that's been obviously drafted many times and worked through several pages, but he still captures that sort of a sense of spontaneity at the beginning, that it takes you by surprise. You suddenly find yourself in the most significant place geographically in your life.
Yeah, I mean, and it takes I love that. It takes one's self myth. This is where it all begins.
Yeah.
And then he everymans it, and says, oh, whatever, I was just an awkward, normal person, just like you reading the poem, nothing to see here. I think too, the this poem represents for me something that I feel is a Larkin move, which is the poem gets kind of kicked off and then also transfigured by the surprise, by something not being the way you expect it. Here it's coming up on the different line, and that difference impacts, the imaginary space in the poem. If it had been the same, as you say, if it had been a normal trip, we would have gone through, let's just call it his Coventry all the time, and the familiarity would have become saturated. It's the surprise that jars the. And there's also the thing about this poem does, which I look for in Larkin's poems, which is, what goes on at the top of the second stanza, which is leaning far out, trying to get into another way of seeing bluntly one's material, but also one's experience. That it takes effort, that this understanding, finding meaning in the moments takes leaning out, takes squinting.
Takes looking.
A word I don't use very ever, though I love it.
It's local dialect that he's using. It's that Coventry dialect that he.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And then looking at the places at first, which are ordinary, before he gets to the place, I guess it's before 5, where he starts being the tour guide through a life, his version of a life, in relationship to whoever this friend is, the sort of foil of the poem, who expects that when one goes into a place which is that familiar, as you say, that rooted, would feel somewhat sentimental about it. Sentimentality tethered to a kind of optimism. The question of, for me, because I don't live where I'm from either, about how one carries as a writer home is something I see in Larkin, and I certainly learned from as a reader. That where you are in the present and where you were in the past, all right, or Lee Faulkner says that the past isn't the past. It's the same thing. And so when he's remarking about how he's got the whole place clearly charted, I feel like he's also making some commentary. This is how I read the poem, or want to read the poem, on where he is at the moment. That he remains the one who doesn't invent, the one who's not noticed, the one who has a kind of internalized shyness, which I know he says in letters and so on, and a stammer, and so forth. And so that those things are cheek by jowl.
On the surface, it's narrative driven, isn't it? By things that happens, things that haven't happened. And the kind of emotion, would you say, is you have to kind of look beneath the surface a little bit more?
Well, there's a little bit of none of these things happen to me, but look at me. I'm a well-known poet. I transcended my beginnings. I have relationships that are fulfilling. I am traveling, and as we know the facts, I'm going to Belfast, where we know he's having an enormous surge of fervor, and yet downplaying dramatically, small d, dramatically downplaying his virtues.
It reminds me of Dockery, obviously, because it's 2 journey poems, and the use of the ellipsis. When he says he's trying to think about the actual childhood, and he says those cycle crates were standing, had we annually departed for all those family halls, and there's a pause as you get that drift of thoughts, and then the whistle went. It reminds me very much, and I really love this stanza from Dockery and Son, where he says, well, it just shows how little yawning, I suppose, I fell asleep. It's that railway journey. It disrupts his line of thought in some way, whether it's just by falling asleep or the whistle goes. Train journeys are not places to have very continual lines of thought. They get disrupted all the time. Yeah,
that's right. And the time gets orchestrated in interesting ways on the trains in Larkin. The train goes to a station, pulls away, and yet the poem can stay in the station it just left. The train goes through a station, and he can imagine what's ahead on the line,
Yeah.
like in the end of What's in Weddings. It turned out to be a terrific device for his imagination.
And then obviously you've got the stanzas where he talks about all the things that didn't happen, which is a very Larkin-esque, isn't it? The unspent childhood. But there's a persona there. I mean, he doesn't, it's not that nothing happened in Coventry or in his childhood. And it's not that he's kind of forgotten about his childhood or anything like that, because he does make references to it throughout his life, and it's not like he had such a terrible childhood he wanted to wipe out any memories of it. So I think he's looking here, and I remember at how we process childhoods in a wider way, isn't he, and how we represent childhoods in literature, and the more sentimental poem I remember, because it's the Thomas Hood poem is very sentimental, simplistic poem, isn't it?
Well, in the Thomas Hood poem, it's childish. He calls it childish ignorance. It's an innocence, flavor for joy. How the swallows were incredible and the fish were incredible, and the family birthdays were incredible, and so everything is always memorable. And the Larkin poem is, I think he's sort of confessing this. I don't remember all the details, so I'll just tell you all the things that didn't happen, which I can remember.
Yeah.
I can pretend, I can project back on my life. I do think the thrill of the poem for me is the dismissal of the friend in the poem, who is looking for one thing, and Larkin will not provide. One could make conjectures about what that friend stands for, but as a foil in the poem, it lets him kind of have his own say to view his life, or how he wants his life to be viewed by the friend. But like you say, there is what occurs in the fact, and then there is the poem, which is its own universe of the relationships. This is what I want you to know about this town, Coventry. Nothing happens in it.
The first stanza of this poem is, did you know it's on the station in Coventry? It's in a plaque. Actually, on platform 1 at Coventry. Yeah. Only the first stanza.
Yeah. Oh, the first stanza. Yes.
Yeah, only the first.
I was going to say, I don't. That must be a town of self-hatred. If they put the whole poem in there.
Yeah, I think they have a bit of a complicated relationship with Larkin. But yeah, I guess there is an ambiguity in this poem. But there's a nice sort of comic Coventry references, about the cycle crates and the men with number plates, because it was this industrial city where the cars were manufactured and bicycles were manufactured. And I like how Larkin sort of sketches Coventry, that this industrial town.
Yeah, I've been curious about a lot of the kind of shorthand about Larkin that I'm skeptical of shorthand, but I would characterize it as he wanted to be a novelist and settled to be a poet, and therefore he wrote little narratives.
Yeah.
In his poems, I think that's oversimplified, but a handy way to start a book review. I don't see the novelist's insight, and I think even Larkin talks about the kind of broadness that novels have, but they feel like sketches.
Yeah.
Not in the way in which some poems could feel like sketches and not really fully realized poems. I don't mean that in the least. But their manner in which they get down details, such as the one you're talking about, cycle crates, which gives you information if you know that information.
Yeah.
Has a kind of sketchbook, plein air presentation. And if you don't know that information, you get all the imagery. I thought he was terrific at that. He's really great at deciding that some things in a poem require a great deal of attention and other things just need to be put into place so you understand what the scene is or the scenario.
Yeah.
A lot of those poems in which he, leans far out again or takes the second look, those second looks seem to me to occur about a third of the way down the poem. It's a very quick kind of setup. And then the remainder of the poem is the interrogation. Self-interrogation. It's almost no memory. It's so fun. There's no memory. There's only invention. You don't get any information. the actual information. You only get what he wants to tell you he didn't do, which is remembered, recast for the whole.
I was trying to look at the rhyme scheme with this, and I got, it doesn't seem like a regular rhyme scheme. I lost track with it after a while. Obviously, you've got rhymes that are very audible, you know, like you look as if you wish the place in hell, my friend said, judging from your face. Oh, well, you know, it's not the place's fault. There's a kind of comic rhyme, depressed and girls all chest, you know, clearly a very a comedic rhyme. But then there's other lines that seem to get rhyming across the stanzas, and you know, you've got departed at the end of stanza 2 and started at the end of stanza 3, but I lost track of the rhyme scheme by then. And I find with Larkin's rhyme schemes are normally very regular, like even if you can't hear them, as you know, they're there in there. And I did wonder what he was doing with the rhyming in this poem.
Well, I guess there's an argument to be made that he lost track. I'm not as troubled by it because maybe the bulk of my reading is in pre-verse because of the American poetry.
Yeah.
And that poets will create the kind of deep pattern of the scheme.
Yeah.
Like this one, you know, that there seems to be a pattern. I think you could take stanza 2 and say, there's a pattern. And then it's picking up with started and charted. And then that pattern breaks down and then it gets picked up somewhere else in some places.
Yeah.
There's kind of an echo factor in this book. And then it maybe feels like it's a scheme or a fixed pattern because of the places you identified, which are so obviously rhyming for effect. But where there is no variety for anywhere at the end of the poem is the there at the top of the next stanza, you know.
Yeah.
But that's not a pattern with the rest of the poem, because the rest of the poem doesn't have a single line as a stand. You know, there's all kinds of variations.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. So
Whereas
you've got there and anywhere.
Yeah, the sense rhyme of that last line is the nothing something. You know, it's that pattern. And so it would make me kind of go back up and look for others of those kind of patterns rather than the inline pattern.
Yeah.
I also think that in rhyming, a lot of clarities for the rhyming patterns generally, or rhyming relationships, and I'll use this word very lightly about rhyme, meaning, comes in the language that's happening right before the rhyme.
Mm.
So, you know, just to take the top stanza, number 1, you know, the language which is coming right before the echo, different, new, number, familiar, and born, are telling a kind of sound and sense story.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't tend to go through every Larkin poem and put A B next to it. But it is interesting sometimes when you look at what he's doing, and I do think I remember he's got a very interesting use of rhyme.
Mm-hmm.
Like I say, it comes in and out of rhyme, and like I say, there's other patterns within the lines where the meanings link together and sort of internal rhyme.
Would you say too that something that people find have affection for in Larkin is that while there is often rhyme patterns, the conversational style can make you omit them in your own reading, which always seems funny to me. Why would anyone want to make rhymes if they want people not to recognize? That seems counterintuitive, but that conversational style, syntax, the kind of I'm just talking here, kind of takes precedence over the rhyme pattern. Though I think that rhyme and meter were really elemental to how he thought a poem should be conceived and how he thought in a poem. You know, one of the things is, you know, Larkin's reputation, the sort of surface reputation, the headline reputation, is the accusation, misogyny on his part. And talking about really undercuts that reputation, that accusation, by representing vulnerability, kind of internalizing despair, acceptance acceptance. Perhaps some of that kind of classic resignation. I don't know if I would say disillusionment so much. I think maybe this poem is read that way. Maybe some loneliness, but it's loneliness in relationship with loneliness. How lonely can it be when you're having such a great relationship with loneliness? Talking in bed. Yeah. Talking in bed ought to be easiest. Lying together there goes back so far, an emblem of the two people being honest. Yet more and more time passes silently. Outside, the wind's incomplete unrest builds and disperses clouds of the sky, and dark towns heap up on the horizon. None of this cares for us. Nothing shows why. At this unique distance from isolation, it becomes still more difficult to find words at once true and kind, or not untrue and not unkind. Tough day for being a poet there.
Have you taught this?
I have taught this. Yeah, I've taught many Larkin poems. I don't think the year has gone by. I've brought him into my students. They're always first a little resistant by what they I think would misrepresent as simplicity, and then they are kind of overtaken by the sometimes like this one, dark charm and the intelligence. And then for those that are trying to write poems, when I share a poem like Talking About, the ordering principle is so instructive. The move in the poem, the ending is devastating. The movement in the poem for me as a maker of poems is what happens from lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The line 8, when he says none of this cares for us, and that's not a huge insight. I think that we are aware that the world goes on, whether we're here or not. It was here before we got here. The clouds, the sky, the horizon, the wind. It was here before we got here. It'll be here when we're gone. That's a Larkin. That's a staple. That's a worldview. But I don't think it's a particularly unique one. 10,000 other poets have written this. But it's the position that this is why I find him so attractive to me. The poem opens with a kind of statement of fact, or proposition, theory, that things ought to be a certain way. There's the first turn, yet more and more. And then there's a delay. And that delay in the poem, it's a way in which he, just in making a poem, just slows everything down, stops the moment, and turns his attention from the moment to the bigger issue, which is it's a small problem in relationship to everything else. It's just being on a planet in the middle of a solar system, middle of a galaxy, like we're in the middle of space, we're mammals. And let's not forget that for a second. And that contextualizing says to me nothing about the kind of standard readings of Larkin as he challenges. It says to me everything about Larkin that also is another element in the larger element of time. It's the ending of Wits and Wedding from a different angle. Outside, the wind's incomplete unrest. Those negatives set up the ending. Outside, the wind's incomplete unrest builds and disperses clouds in the sky, and dark towns heap up. It's I guess could be read as what's happening in this house is happening in other houses in their own fashion. They too are under now here you got to fill in your own reading, attack or comfort of time, or distance or nature. Then there's the line, none of this cares for us. Nothing shows why at this unique distance from isolation. The isolation is not happening in the house. It's happening. That's what existence is. It becomes more difficult. And that's when the poem gets back to the story. Well, by my counting, that's 1, 2, 3 lines 6 lines of this poem are about the couple, and the rest are about the context. And you take a bed, which is sort of the ground zero for a home.
Yeah.
For a relationship. The rhyming in the poem, I'm going to anticipate this. Easiest to honest is really great. The T kinds and the fines, but this is honest and unrest. Sky and why, that's the meta subject. And then the parts of the poem that I often attracted to when it comes to rhyme is what's happening right in front of the rhyme. Has similar kind of stories. Ought to be, goes back, people being, which completely sets up time passes, and yet it's incomplete. You can't assess it fully. Incomplete, distance, difficult.
Archie Burnett, he says, he quotes the letter that Monica wrote to Larkin, and she said, "I'm naturally not happy about talking in bed because it will cause so much talking here, in and out of beds, and indeed elsewhere. What do you think your mother and relatives will make of it?"
Well, if every poet had to answer to what their mother would think of the poems, we wouldn't have as many poems.
Yeah, we wouldn't get very far.
No, when my first book came out, my mother accused me of making it all up.
Yeah, it would be very limiting, but clearly it had an impact on Monica as his partner.
I think it would. Letting this poem out to the world is a way of talking. But I also don't think that I want to be only a literalist with Larkin's poems. I don't think that they were composed in that way. I think that he's fashioned a sketch, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, that is, it's not about his life. It's drawn from his life. I mean, I think that is a better way of thinking about poetry that is, quote, autobiographic. The lyric poem, which is about the nature of a single speaker, isn't a report on experience. I can't say whether or not her response reflects the truth of a relationship. Who knows what happens when people close the door to the bedroom? Maybe I'm trying to make an excuse because I'm a poet, and I just don't think that everything I write is necessarily a confession, but it is a impression of what one experiences, and one could have experienced this for one night and thought, there's poem. One could have experienced this over time, but it doesn't say it's fatal. It's just saying it's real. And if you're coming to read Larkin and your feelings for the kind of poetry you want to read is the kind of poetry that lets you reflect upon your own experience, you couldn't find a more true.
Like you said at the beginning, it's a poem about deep vulnerability, about what you reveal about yourself when you're in bed with somebody, you're in that, you've got that physical closeness with somebody, you're in you know, there's so much expectations around what happens and how you behave and how you talk, and it ought to be easiest, and it's an emblematic moment. So you had the kind of weight of history upon you that you can't always live up to as a flawed human being, as we all are.
Yeah, and you know, people aren't machines.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you want to talk, sometimes you don't, and sometimes over time, it's not what it's a reflection on what one does in a relationship. Different things take on different importances. You know, sure, for lovers, their bed is the most important place. But he's not talking about lovers. He's talking about people who share a bed. They may or may not be lovers. They may be lovers sometimes and may not be lovers sometimes. They may have many other ways in which they are intimate in a relationship, in the way in which they make their day. But this is, you know, in contrast to the kind of the glossy magazines in which, you know, one has to keep it hot all the time. And I feel like he's really after something else. Nothing shows why at this unique distance from isolation, it becomes still more difficult to find. Which means you're looking to find words that are articulate. And silence is a way of expressing that kind of truth. I mean, he's not always, he rides trains, but when he's on he's on a train in a poem, he's a guy on a train in a poem. You know, he has relationships with, as we know from the biographies, different people, but when he's in the poem Talking in Bed, he's having that relationship that one is having in Talking in Bed. And I think that poets who are especially familiar in their poems, I mean, meaning the poems are highly accessible about the scenarios and sketches in the poems, easily get, we're looking for a one-to-one correspondence with which woman is he talking about? It wasn't Monica at all. Maybe it was some other relationship, or maybe it was a feeling of an imaginary sense of projection, desire for change. But the poem is about this figure lamenting, trying not to be a bad person.
The sort of emblematic nature of lying side by side. Obviously, you've got an Arundel tomb as the final poem in the same collection, based very clearly in a particular church and a particular pair of statues that you can go and visit. And yet, at the end, you have that the time has transfigured them into untruth, this transfiguration of where we come and put on what we see, we put on our own interpretations, on our own, we take away our own feelings and beliefs. And at the end of an Arundel tomb, our almost instinct, almost true, what will survive of us of luck. Obviously, that final line is something that gets taken away from Larkin in itself. People quite often chop that final line off and transfigure what Larkin was getting at, because he said it's almost instinct and it's almost true.
You British poets get in trouble when you start using love in your lines. Auden has paid a price too for saying we must love one another and die, and that line has been stolen from the poem to mean.
Yeah, it's a big word to use.
Yeah, careful.
Yeah,
careful how others will use your line.
And being kind it's an interesting word that comes up in Larkin, obviously, and the Moa. Trying to be kind I think being kind it can be a bit underestimated as a value, and it can be a very difficult thing, to be kind.
And what do you make of that? Because I know in the poems, the poet, the speaker, Larkin, struggles with generosity. Though everything you read about Larkin is that he was very generous and had great long friendships, and their kindness didn't seem to be something he struggled with in his day-to-day life. So somewhere the figure in the poems is often enough trying to be better, not always succeed.
Last podcast we were talking about Friday night in the Royal Station Hotel, and that's got the image of the towns folding, waves fall behind villages. Now night comes on, waves fold behind villages. But it's again, it's about that, what's encroaching behind you, isn't it? What's going on around you?
Yeah.
And you've got the kind of microcosm and the macrocosm.
I kind of come to that line about the dark towns as somewhat naturalistic, and a place where, a word like dark kind of wants to send you into looking for ambiguity, though it may, in this case, simply be direct observation. I feel like another poem that passage has tethers in, and connects to the Sad Steps, where he's looking out over the roofs, and they're coming into view, or they're kind of coming into view, sharpening, much the way this one is, where he's a poet who likes to look out the window at the tops of houses.
He does, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I just don't see much more than that. Largely, I put sort of my attention on sort of 90% of that is just direct observation. Yeah. It's a way of saying, I'm alone, but I'm alone in a civic space. I'm alone in my poem, but that's just because I'm awake.
Yeah.
And everything else is dashing. Perhaps for Larkin's imagination, nighttime, wind time, roof time, these are places in which he uses in a poem to kind of recalibrate where he is in the poem, and then makes his move to the next part. Sad sets, 4 o'clock, There's the wedge shadowed gardens. There's the cavernous wind-picked sky. There's the moon. And once he gets to the moon, then he sets up the counterpoint to the Sydney poem. These things are in use in the poem. On a literary sense, this is what I meant earlier about really recognizing and learning from the way in which he orders his materials in the poems, and also elemental, but they're not the most essential part of the poem. They're put in place to make a move.
Well, we know that once he moved out of Pearson Park and once he moved out of the flat with the high windows, his poetry just faltered really and came to an end. And he needed to be high up to write his poetry.
I can't even imagine. I mean, I know for myself as a writer, I have to have a window.
Yeah.
I'm from Texas. The sky in Texas goes on. I mean, I'm quite sure I can see Hull from any window in Texas. You know, if I just look far enough, I will see all the way across the ocean. I certainly can see as far south as Buenos Aires, and I can see as far north as Edmonton. You know, it's just because Texas is so flat.
Yeah.
The sky is where the interesting information is.
Yeah.
But the clouds are always on the move. They're always changing. I grew up in the Gulf side of Texas, so because of the moisture coming off the Gulf of Mexico, as it should be known, the skyscape to me was more interesting than the landscape. We just moved into a new house last month, and I'm in a place. I'm on the top floor of the house. I had 2 banks of windows, and immediately I began writing because I can see. Well, I'm looking to trees, but I can see something of a horizon, and it just opens up my imagination. So I completely, 100% am Larkin-esque about needing to look out a window.
If you go to the Brimwell Jones Library in Hull, it's got an amazing viewing gallery, you know, 1 floor basically, quite high up.
Really?
And you can, and obviously East Yorkshire is very flat, and you can see an incredible distance.
I'd love to go.
Yeah.
I would love to go. I would love to go to England and do something of a Larkin tour. The British poetry is so important to me. As a writer, I know, well, you know, a few Scottish ballads, which I think are kind of at the root of at least at the root of the quatrain for British poetry.
Yeah.
And I don't think I would be a writer without British at all. Thinking of 20th century centric poets from England, James Heaney, Ted Hughes. Though she's ours, I think she was influenced deeply by British writing, Sylvia Plath.
Yeah.
Those kind of mid-century modernists, that's the word. They were furniture, really important to me. Take John Keats. Like, if I met John Keats, you know, that came like, well, if you had dinner with so-and-so, who would you have dinner with? Well, I'd have dinner with John Keats. What would you want to talk about? And I think, well, I would never ask him because I probably know the odes better than he does.
Yeah.
You know, I might ask him about his brothers, you know. Certainly ask him about his mother.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd want to, you know, trying to be a doctor. Like, I'd want to just engage him and let him talk about what he wants to talk about. But the odes, he should ask me about because I know them better. No doubt.
Yeah. You should come over to Hull and East Yorkshire. I'm in Sheffield, so I'm 70 miles away. But my mum was born in Hull. All my mum's family are from the East Yorkshire area. And me and my husband have just spent a couple of days in Holderness. So we've been on the coast and to some of the churches and some of the little towns that Larkin used to cycle out to visit. And every time I go over there and go over to Hull, I can't think of any other place or any other writer where they're so closely associated in such a fascinating ways, because London is a wonderful city and there's lots of writers based in London, but I don't feel like anyone owns London in the way that Larkin sort of owns Hull, or Hull owned Larkin in some way, that interlinking between the two of them. And the fact that he physically added to the landscape of Hull with the building, the library, which is the most astonishing building. I could look at it for hours. It's just the most a remarkable building. It looks so, even now it looks so modern and so distinctive. But just to walk past, to walk around Pearson Park and to go around the pubs, and just, you feel he's so close. And you do talk to people that met him. And just today on Blue Sky, because I do some of the Blue Sky posts for the society. Somebody got in touch today to say they remember being in the university bar and seeing Larkin drinking and singing to one of the barmaids. And I don't know this person. I don't remember him being in touch with us before. He's not somebody I'm familiar with. But it's so lovely to hear people say that. And our chair, Graham Chesters, was a colleague of Larkin and has some really great stories about his work with Larkin and his encounters with Larkin. It's fantastic.
Yeah. We have a poet in Oregon. I'm not from here, so maybe I shouldn't say we, but named William Stafford. And Stafford won the National Book Award in the mid-60s. Maybe the most celebrated. Not the only poet from Oregon to win that award, but one of the most celebrated poets from Oregon. He was actually from Kansas. And different poet than Larkin entirely.
Yeah.
Well, similar in the aesthetic and accessibility, for sure, but a very sincere political poet. But he died on after Larkin, maybe in the early 90s, late 80s, I think. Bill died. And before I moved here. And there's a William Stafford Society. There is an annual birthday. His birthday's in January, and there are readings throughout the state still of reading of William Stafford's poems. And, I know that's true of other poets in other places, and place matters. That they centered their imaginary life in one place, typically lived in that place. That's not always the case. Typically live in that place. And the people who came to their work feel seen in their poems. You wouldn't necessarily call Larkin a poet of place. As you say, his seat of perception, how he viewed existence, grounded in the streets and sidewalks and built of a Hull.
Thank you so much to David for being so generous with his time. We know that listeners in the US make up the second highest group geographically after listeners in the UK, and it's great to be able to hear from Larkin fans from all around the world. In preparation for talking to David, he recommended that I have a look at his book, A Long High Whistle, Selected Columns on Poetry, published in 2015, which is a collection of his pithy and fascinating articles on poets and poetry from Ovid and Catullus all the way to modern-day writers from all around the world. It really is excellent, and I recommend you try and track down a copy. I'll put the details in the show notes. David said he'd like to come back and talk about Larkin the novelist, so we look forward to welcoming him back to do that for sure. Looking ahead to the Philip Larkin Society year, there are lots of events currently being planned, so if you've not already signed up to our mailing list, then please do so via our website. Or if you're not already a member and are thinking about taking the plunge, then you'll be very welcome on board. If that's not mixing metaphors. We're currently looking forward to our AGM, which will take place in Hull this year on Saturday the 7th of June, which is always a very convivial event with a guest speaker, a chance to catch up with old friends over lunch, and not to forget some time out to buy some lovely society merchandise, with all PLS members invited to attend. Last year's AGM at the Bodleian Library in Oxford was a fantastic event. Some of you may remember Professor Kelvin Everest back in May 2022 talking to us on the podcast about his memories of Larkin and Monica in Leicester in the early 1970s, when Kelvin was a young lecturer in English at the university. We're very excited that Kelvin is going to be talking about this in person at the University of Leicester as part of their Literary Leicester celebrations in conjunction with the Philip Larkin Society on March 22nd. It's a ticketed event, but it's free to come along and open to the public. All are welcome. I will put the links in the show notes and hope to see lots of you there. This podcast was produced by me, Lynn Lockwood, and Gavin Hogg, and the music was The Horns of the Morning by the Mechanicals Band. If you have any questions, comments or ideas for future topics, then please, as ever, do get in touch.
The horns of the morning are blowing, are shining. The meadow is wet with the coldest of dew. The dawn reassembles with a clash of gold.